Connection listeners, what in the world should the world and the United States be doing about East Timor? Our phone is 1-800-423-8255 or 1-800-423-TALK. Makes the East Timor connection. Bob Hefner, you're just back from Indonesia for the last 8 months, right up to the voting for independence in East Timor. Tell us, how do we explain this killing? Some people describe it as chaos, but a miserable situation.
It is a miserable situation. It is chaos. It's organized chaos. All evidence indicates, as I think the Western press, Western media has emphasized, that much of the militia activity was paid for, organized, and certainly supplied with military weapons by elements of the Indonesian military. It's important, if difficult, but it's important nonetheless to put the violence in the larger Indonesian context if we want to understand why this happened. President Habibie, as well as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, General Wiranto, are on record and off the record indicate quite clearly that they were in favor of a free and fair plebiscite in East Timor, and in fact all evidence indicates that both of them, and I know personally Habibie, wants East Timor to go its own way, if for no other reason than Indonesian national interests. However, there are elements within the military who are opposed, many elements in the military who are opposed to Habibie, and also rogue elements, in fact, quite substantial rogue elements of the military who are opposed to Wiranto. And East Timor, in an Indonesian context, is but the most recent in a series of violent escapades engaged in by these rogue elements. We've had mass killings of hundreds of people in Ambon, in Kalimantan, and it began really much earlier, in 1995, 1996, with some killings in East Java, which were largely unreported or misreported, if I could say that, in the West. So this is, among other things, in addition to being an awful humanitarian tragedy for East Timorese, for Indonesia, it's part of the ongoing struggle between lightly democratic and vigorously anti-democratic, anti-reform elements of the military.
And what do you suppose drives the military here and the rogue elements in this kind of vengeance on the East Timorese?
In the first instance, and I know many people may not be happy with this explanation, there's a deep desire on the part of the rogue elements of the military to embarrass, discredit, and ultimately drive out Habibie and Wiranto. That they would be willing to sacrifice the lives of hundreds of East Timorese in this process may surprise us, but again, they've done this in other parts of Indonesia prior to this time.
Professor Chomsky, what's the relevant history here as you see it?
Well, the relevant history begins in late 1975 when Portugal decolonized. Portugal had a revolution. It moved towards decolonization of its territories. That was both in Africa and in Asia. And might notice that pretty much the same thing happened both in Africa and in Asia. In Asia, Indonesia invaded East Timor. Incidentally, East Timor has nothing to do with Indonesia. It's no more a part of Indonesia than occupied France was part of Germany during the Second World War. Indonesia invaded East Timor with strong U.S. support, U.S. arms, U.S. diplomatic support. That's been described rather frankly by the U.S. UN ambassador at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And his words we should attend to his words. They're significant. This 20 years ago, the United Nations Security Council did order Indonesia immediately to withdraw. But as Moynihan pointed out, his words were, the State Department wanted things to turn out as they did. I was given the responsibility of rendering the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it might do, and I carried out this responsibility with considerable success. He goes on to describe the success. He says within a few months, apparently about 60,000 people had been killed, and then the issue sort of disappeared. Well, didn't disappear. It went on. Indonesia continued its aggression. It peaked around 1977, 78. Again, with the strong support of the Carter administration this time, which extended the flow of arms. The figures of 200,000 people killed that you hear now were coming from very reliable church sources in East Timor in 1978. That's when the mass killings went on, the mass starvation and so on. And so it's continued right up till the present. That's the relevant history. The U.S. And Britain came in strongly, in fact, about at the time that the massacres peaked, about 78. Britain started being a major arms supplier, and other Western countries as well. France, for example, in 1978, the French foreign minister went to Jakarta and right at the peak of the massacres and announced, it was well reported in Le Monde, that France would protect Indonesia from any form of censure or and would continue to support it at the peak of the atrocities. That's the 200,000 killed that people are hearing about. And that's the same is true of the Netherlands, it's true of Sweden, but the primary responsibility is clearly the United States and secondarily Britain. Australia also. Australia has become the major arms supplier and trainer of the military, including the commandos who are apparently carrying out the major atrocities. The Kopassus commandos, who are modeled on the Green Berets and are a very much feared force. Well, Ben Anderson, who's one of the leading Western specialists on Indonesia, describes them as the dread Indonesian special forces modeled on the U.S. Green Berets and legendary for their cruelty. They're the ones who were sent to East Timor. They've been there for a long time, but they were sent again in the past few months from Jakarta and are apparently the most directly involved in organizing and directing, and sometimes directly participating in the atrocities. The UN there's not much left of the UN in Jakarta and Dili. In fact, Dili itself, the capital, is apparently mostly destroyed. But there are a couple hundred people in a UN compound which is under attack, and their view is quite different. They, in the Australian press just yesterday, UN official, there are some Australian journalists still there, a UN official in the compound said, make no mistake, this is being directed from Jakarta, high-ranking Western official. He says this is not a situation where a few gangs of ragtag militia are out of control. As everyone here knows, it's been a military operation from start to finish, run from Jakarta.
Well, let's, I guess we assume that, not assume, but I guess let's take your point that Jakarta and the United States are up to their eyeballs in the history of this killing. For the United States, what are the chances to turn away from it, or to turn a new page? And does anybody in the Clinton administration want to do that at this point? Professor Chomsky.
I have, of course, no inside information, but take, say, the front page story, the lead story on this in the New York Times this morning by Elizabeth Becker and Philip Shannon, both Southeast Asia specialists. They're very frank. They say the United States is resisting any form of pressures against Indonesia, and they explain why. Indonesia is a mineral-rich nation of 200 million people. East Timor is a tiny, impoverished territory of 800,000 people. Okay, but the conclusions follow quite correctly.
Tom Friedman of the New York Times and of the new book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, which we talked about on The Connection. We live in a post-Kosovo world where human rights challenges claims of sovereignty. What's to be done here, in your view, Tom?
Well, I think that what is to be done is really to put an ultimatum to the Habibie government that it's got to either take hold of this situation in Dili in a responsible way and implement what is clearly an overwhelming vote in favor of independence, or face certainly diplomatic and economic sanctions. I don't see as a practical matter a UN or American force or Australian force physically invading East Timor. But I think the pressure clearly has to be ratcheted up. To read the paper, I'm just back from Australia myself, and I haven't really done any immediate reporting on this. To read the paper, One hears about telephone calls from Secretary Albright to Ali Alatas. One reads about the president having sent letters to Habibi, but they don't seem to be having much effect either. And as Professor Chomsky noted, we did have a front-page story here. Clearly, the Pentagon view is that not only don't they want to get involved with U.S. troops, but they're kind of taking the view that Indonesia continues to be an important ally and strategic asset for the United States. Whether that's true or not is another question. I think there is a concern that Indonesia has the potential to be the Yugoslavia of Southeast Asia. You've got a separatist movement in the north in Aceh, a Muslim separatist movement trying to pull away there as well, and it has certain historic roots. And I think that the delicate thing here is to obviously bring this Timor situation to a peaceful resolution without unraveling, sort of pulling the ripcord on Indonesia altogether. I think you got a very fragile situation there. And we need a transfer of power there from Habibi to obviously a much more popularly supported government. And that's sort of how I see it. I see it as a...
But Tom, let me just ask, you used that line in the paper yesterday, the Yugoslavia of Southeast Asia. If that's the case, though, I mean, we are the main banker, military supplier of the Milosevic of Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. How do we get off that spot? And how do we deal with our own history in the case?
Well, I think, as pointed out, our history is really ugly in the case of Indonesia, and it's nothing to be proud of. It was an outgrowth of the Cold War. It's a common history of the United States in that part of the world, whether it was with Marcos in the Philippines or Suharto in Indonesia. And I think the trick is obviously to get off that policy, but to do it in a way that doesn't unravel Indonesia. And I think the only way to do that is obviously to be as firm as possible with Habibi and make it clear that he is going to pay a terrible economic price. Unfortunately, it's going to mean a lot of little people are going to suffer for that. But I don't know any other way to do it short of an invasion of East Timor, which, as a practical matter, I just don't see happening.
Bob Hefner, I wonder if you sort of accept the history that we're talking about here, and do you like the line, the Yugoslavia of Southeast Asia?
Yes, I think the line Yugoslavia of Southeast Asia is very real and should be a central concern, both of people who care about Indonesians and also people, those others who look at Indonesia primarily from a U.S. strategic perspective. But if I could return to a point that Tom Friedman raised, and the question of the Habibi government and pressure on the Habibi government, this also touches on the matter of U.S. history. The U.S. over the past few years has made quite clear, as has Germany, that they would prefer that East Timor be let go, or at least be allowed to make its own future and determine its own destiny. The Clinton administration has not made this a high priority in any sense, but it's been the message communicated through diplomatic channels. Ali Alatas, the Indonesian foreign minister, Habibi, as well as General Wiranto, are all personally sick of East Timor. Again, they don't have any deep humanitarian concern over the issue, but they would prefer to see it go. Habibi is very clear on this. Dewi Fortuna Anwar, the primary advisor to Habibi on East Timor, who's a good friend of mine, has for years, long before she had any influence in government, said that Indonesia should let East Timor go. It was a mistake from the beginning. So the question then becomes, I think that raised by Tom Friedman, which is the pressure has been ratcheted up. Why is there ratcheted up? Why is there no impact? There is no impact because the Indonesian government itself is in chaos right now. And not merely the Indonesian government, but the Indonesian military. There is a battle raging. It's been raging since the anti-Chinese violence of last May, which brought Suharto down, but which also saw the rape of more than 100 Indonesian Chinese women and the death of more than 1,000 people in Jakarta. Since then, there's been other incidents of violence on a similar scale in Ambon and other parts of Indonesia. Again, not deeply reported, but caught up, noted in the Western media. All this is not some sort of resurgence of primordial passions, as it's sometimes portrayed. It is a matter of deep conflict among the Indonesian elite, and one of the issues on which they're taking issue is the question of regional autonomy. In East Timor, for some hardliners, rogue hardliners in the military is seen as a test case. If it goes, they believe the rest of Indonesia goes. Now, that's a deeply wrong perspective, and needless to say, the violence that they've inflicted on the rest of the nation has, if anything, only accelerated or increased the chance that Indonesia could become another Yugoslavia. But that is their position, and that's why Habibie is not responding to this pressure, because he has no control over his military.
Professor Chomsky, do you want to question the thought that the Indonesian government and the American government have really changed their hearts on the subject?
Well, the Indonesian government has recognized for some time that, as the Foreign Minister Ali Alatas pointed out a couple of years ago, that East Timor is a pebble in our shoe. It was becoming a bit of an annoyance. On the other hand, they've given no indication of, apart from Habibie, that's true that Habibie has been quite clear about actually initiating the referendum and supporting it. But there's not much indication of any other support. I mean, the Kapasas troops, for example, were sent by the Central Command in Jakarta. They're not really rogue elements. I don't quite agree that I don't know that the United States has ratcheted up the pressure. I don't have any evidence about that. As Mr. Friedman pointed out, we know that some letters were sent. But what's been reported is backing off. That is nothing. You know, the Indonesian generals would be. It would be understandable if they interpreted what the United States has done as saying, we're going to keep away, do what you want. Maybe more has happened internally, but since the letters haven't been released despite requests, we really don't know. If you read, say, the Times report this morning on it says they're leaving the initiative to the Pentagon. Well, the Pentagon has long-standing contacts with the Indonesian military, wants to maintain them. And that General Shelton will be putting significant pressure on the Indonesian military is at least questionable. I should say there are other issues in the background which we shouldn't forget about. I don't want to go into the whole history, but first, the United States has no principled objection to the breaking up of Indonesia. The analogy to Yugoslavia may be correct, but then it's worth remembering that 40 years ago, the United States carried out probably its largest ever post-war clandestine operations under Eisenhower to try to separate off the outer islands from Indonesia. Supported a major rebellion there, which was intended to break up Indonesia. That failed, and at that point the U.S. turned to support for the Indonesian military. The concern and also I think we should be a little cautious about talking about this as a Cold War issue. Of course, everything that's happened is permeated by the Cold War. But the concern was not Russia. In fact, Eisenhower himself was very vociferous about that in internal discussion. No Russian involvement. There was a concern about China, but it's a little misleading to call that a Cold War issue. I mean, through the 1960s, as U.S. support for Indonesian atrocities increased, China and Russia were hardly allies. In fact, they were practically at war. And that concern, the concern which goes way back to the end of the Second World War, is that Asia may form some kind of relatively independent bloc, something like the Japanese New Order, which we fought the Second World War to stop, and that the countries of Southeast Asia and even Japan would accommodate to China, as the internal documents call it, and that has to be prevented. These concerns lie behind U.S. policy in Indonesia, behind the Indochina War, and they go right up till today. Just a few days ago, President Jiang Zemin of China made a very important speech, which was pretty widely reported in Southeast Asia and in the British business press, Financial Times, but not here. But surely the Clinton administration and the Jakarta generals are paying attention to it, just as the Thai and others are. He condemned U.S. what he called gunboat diplomacy, but he also increased his overtures towards the Southeast Asian countries, the ASEAN countries. The speech was in Thailand, in fact, and received a pretty supportive reaction there, in which he discussed regional security issues, proposing once again that China be at the core of them and that the U.S. be kind of marginalized. That's been a concern for 50 years now.
Professor Chomsky, stand by, and Tom Friedman and Bob Hefner. We're talking about the carnage in East Timor and what the world is or isn't going to do about it. 1-800-423-8255 makes the East Timor connection. 1-800-423-TALK. Hannah is on the line. Hello, Hannah. Welcome.
I have a question for my colleague Bob Hefner, whose analysis I think was excellent. I've just heard from friends in Jakarta who have relatives in Kupang that there are militia from East Timor who are now attacking independence supporters outside the boundaries of East Timor in West Timor, and there have also been reports of such attacks in Java. And I wonder if Bob can confirm these reports and how that would alter his analysis.
Hannah, thank you.
Hello, Hannah. Thank you very much. I cannot confirm those reports, but I can confirm that anti-independence elements of East Timor have been used for other acts of violence. They were used in a riot, an quote-unquote anti-Christian, anti-Chinese riot that shook the city of Situbondo in East Java in 1996. So this history of, again, a faction of the military using gangs, criminals, and in this instance, renegade anti-independence folk in East Timor has a longer history. So I would not be surprised if there were those sorts of attacks taking place in West Timor.
If I can interject a word, that has been reported in the Australian press.
Exactly what has?
That there have been attacks in Kupang and rounding up people and so on. That's West Timor, part of Indonesia.
Good. Hannah, thank you. 1-800-423-8255, the East Timor connection. Oded is on the line.
Hi.
Welcome.
I had a couple of quick questions, although most of my thunder has been stolen by the presenter's excellent presentations. One would be, could pressure from the IMF and World Bank be effective in bringing Indonesia into alignment with what people think should happen, especially since that seems to be what Wiranto, Habibie, and Alatas want? Second, since I don't really expect people at places like the IMF to become political missionaries, in the longer term, is there a way to affect how these people are chosen? And the third question, which I think was mostly answered, is what legitimacy does Indonesia have exactly as a nation, and what would be wrong with allowing it to break up?
Tom Friedman, you've written about the IMF connection. What's the answer here?
The chances of the IMF and World Bank laying down any political ultimatums are between 0 and 0. But I don't think they're the operational actor here. It will be first and foremost Indonesian investors. The Jakarta stock market crashed this morning. I can't give you the exact figures, but it took a nosedive. But what effect that will have on political decision making, I can't tell you. I think that the point that Professor Hefner made is a very good one. It's not clear that when people like Habibie and Alatas pull levers and push buttons in relation to the Indonesian army, that the levers aren't just coming off in their hands, and that they're pushing on a string there. So I don't know if the situation inside well enough to know whether they're playing some double game on us, whether the Indonesian military is really quietly doing the bidding of Habibie and Alatas, and they're telling us, gosh, they're out of control, or whether indeed they are out of control. So I don't really see the IMF doing anything, but it starts, first of all, with Indonesian investors and what they're doing, and what they did today was sell out their market.
Well, that's sort of Friedman 101, isn't it, that politics is all about the flow of investment capital nowadays? Well,
it's a lot about it. It's not all about it, but it is a factor.
Bob Hefner, do you want to add to that or not?
I would second it heartily. The rupiah has lost about 40% of its value since the violence.
With what consequences for the government?
Well, with serious consequences in terms of debt management and trying to get this economy, which has been in not merely a recession, but a depression for the past 2 years, trying to get it going again.
We're talking about the violence in East Timor on a rampage among militias backed by the Indonesian government. which is backed by the United States government, most especially since the vote on independence last week. Our guests are Bob Hefner, Tom Friedman, Noam Chomsky. This is The Connection from WBUR Boston and PRI Public Radio International. I'm Christopher Light, and this is The Connection, the East Timor Connection. We're talking about the orgy of Indonesian violence in the island of East Timor, most especially since East Timorese voted overwhelmingly for their own independence. Our guests are Robert Hefner from Boston University, who's just back from Indonesia, Noam Chomsky of MIT, Tom Friedman of the New York Times. Tom Friedman, put this back in the framework of a post-Kosovo world where we intervened in no uncertain terms on humanitarian grounds, despite real ambiguities about Yugoslavian sovereignty. What does the post-Kosovo world mean in Asia?
I don't think it means anything in Asia. I don't think that any of the precedents, if you want to call them that, that applied in Yugoslavia will be translated in Asia. And it has to do
precedents that aren't applied aren't precedents very long.
That's right. And I mean, the lessons of Kosovo there are no lessons probably. And I think you have to look at it very much in the local and regional context. The Australians, who, as Professor Chomsky has noted, have been up to their ears in cooperation with the Indonesian military and the Suharto government over the years, have a very specific and naked self-interest here. They have a big, beautiful, underpopulated country, and they know that if Indonesia does go the way of Yugoslavia and does break up, and there are massive boat people, the most likely place they're going to come are to the shores of Australia. And so their very naked self-interest here dictates that they are very ready and willing to send troops as part of a UN force, to in effect be the UN force under a different helmet, that would provide peacekeepers for East Timor so that the referendum on independence can be implemented. I think the most you'll see out of this administration, which I think always looked at Kosovo not as some precedent, but as some that would be applied elsewhere, but rather some massive, huge bullet they dodged that should never be repeated. I think the most you'd see out of this administration is to support a UN peacekeeping force, in vote, possibly give it logistical support, but I do not think you're going to see any American troops on the ground, and certainly not by way of invasion into East Timor the way we saw in Kosovo.
Professor Chomsky, should we want to get more mileage out of the Kosovo doctrine here or not?
Well, I don't want to go into this here, but I don't agree about the Kosovo doctrine. I do not think that I think the evidence is quite overwhelming that it was not out of humanitarian concern, but out of quite traditional great power interests. And in that respect, I think the lesson of Kosovo is things are as they always are. And the lesson of East Timor is the same. Actually, the Kosovo analogy has been brought up a lot, not without justification. Perhaps a closer analogy is the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This is an Indonesian invasion of East Timor. It happens that in this case it's been initially strongly supported and continually supported, maybe now less strongly, by the United States and other great powers. But apart from that, it's an invasion by a powerful, rich country of a small, actually, to increase the analogy, oil-producing region. And in fact, Australia and Indonesia made a shocking treaty to split up the offshore oil of East Timor about 10 years ago. This is, Indonesia has no rights there, no legitimacy. The right of self-determination was not only upheld by the Security Council, but also by the World Court. The only country that gave, Western country, that gave de jure recognition to the occupation was Australia, for the reasons that Mr. Friedman pointed out, and others. But they've essentially withdrawn that. In fact, withdrawn it more strongly than any other country. So this is, it happens to be a long, drawn-out invasion and occupation with huge crimes, way beyond anything attributed to Saddam Hussein and Kuwait. I do not believe, I tend to agree that military forces are first of all, it's very unlikely, but also it's probably not necessary. If the United States took a clear and decisive stand instead of waffling about it and informed the Indonesian generals that this game is over, it would very likely work. Actually, we saw a rather dramatic example of that in May 1998. Suharto had essentially lost his usefulness. He was no longer our kind of guy, as the Clinton administration had said shortly before. He'd lost control. He wasn't following IMF orders. In May 1998, Madeleine Albright called him up and told him that the time has come for what she called a democratic transition. A couple hours later, he stepped down. It's not that simple. You don't just push buttons. But that does illustrate the power relations. And I think they know how to proceed if they want to. Beyond that, there are further steps that can be taken. For example, the threat of war crimes trials could be very severe. Actually, there's one Indonesian general, General Panjaitan, who already was condemned by a Boston court, in fact, for his role in the Dili massacre, and can't come to the United States. And the threat of being cooped up in Indonesia is serious. The IMF won't act on its own, of course, but it's essentially run by the United States. If the U.S. decides to just make some gestures about potential sanctions, they'll hear it. U.S. multinationals are all over Indonesia. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had a report on their concerns. Well, that's more pressure. The military contacts are very clear, not just the United States, but Britain and Australia as well. Until such measures are at least seriously pursued, I don't think it's even, we can't assume that a military force is necessary. If it is, it would be justified.
Bob Hefner, would it help
if I could just say one thing? I think that the point that Professor Chomsky raised about the threat of war crimes, I do think that is a threat that hasn't been put on the table. And it's one I think that is really worth considering. I think that's actually a very good idea.
Sounds as if Madeleine Albright spoke very, very plainly to the old government. I mean, what if President Clinton said, it's a bad game and it's over? Bob Hefner?
Well, let me go back just a little bit to the downfall of Suharto. Suharto, if I beg to disagree, didn't step down because of U.S. pressure, although it's important to note that he and his reactionary supporters still today say that was the case, so that people who are in his camp and who are active and who are perpetrating, I might note, much of the violence that we're witnessing today in Timor and other places, they endorse this line that Suharto stepped down merely because of Western pressure. Suharto stepped down because he lost the support of the military elite. It's as simple as that. And the military saw him basically as a deficit in terms of their own long-term interests, not merely in terms, and indeed not even primarily in terms of the United States, not in the short run, perhaps a longer, yes, but in terms of what he was doing, how he was wrecking the economy, and how his children were destroying the political and economic system of Indonesia. That's why Suharto stepped down in the immediate instance. Now, on the question of what kind of pressure the U.S. has, I think the U.S. does have great pressure and a great ability to exercise pressure here. And I agree with Tom Friedman that if a clear, unambiguous message were sent, the military would respond, Wiranto would respond. That much said, I have to emphasize again that we must recognize that the Indonesian military itself has been in a battle with itself for the past year, and this is but the most recent chapter in a series of incidents of violence.
Connection listeners, what about East Timor? 1-800-423-8255 makes the connection with Bob Hefner, Tom Friedman, and Noam Chomsky. Ben is on the line.
Hello.
Hello, Ben.
You've done such a tremendous job of filling me in around all the issues that I wanted to bring up initially, and you've changed my thinking from a human rights event to one that has to do with strategic purposes of the United States government and other governments like Australia with reference to China. Could you address more to that case? In other words, is Indonesia as a monolith or trying to be one, an Australian and United States defense against China? In other words, is this something to prevent the complete takeover by Asia? By the Chinese of Asia.
Freudian slip there, Ben.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot of people in
Bob Hefner.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the region too who share an interest in seeing a complex balance of power across Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia. Japan shares that interest. Thailand, the Philippines, a lot of other nations who have ambivalent attitudes towards the United States share that concern that Indonesia should maintain a degree of foreign policy independence.
Ben, thank you. 1-800-423-TALK. Joe is calling from Lake Placid, New York.
Hi, I wanted to talk to you about the U.S. economic ties to Indonesia. Professor Chomsky alluded to it earlier. I wanted to mention just regarding how intertwined the U.S. is with Indonesia, how much pressure could we put on them by threatening to sever those ties, and what negative effects would that have on the U.S. as well? Is this a situation like with China, how we're afraid to cut off MFN because it would hurt us just as much as it would hurt them, and we would lose those markets? And is this viable? Would we ever consider cutting off relations with Indonesia as a kind of a tool to get them to act in our direction?
Tom Friedman, I presume we wouldn't, but why not?
Well, I'm really not an expert, I'm afraid, on the economic ties between the U.S. Corporations and Indonesia. There are a lot of mining companies there. There is some manufacturing, I know, and the country is clearly a market. It's the fourth largest country in the world. But how much it actually occupies in our sort of mercantile consciousness, maybe Professor Chomsky knows better, or Professor Hefner. I'm take a pass on that, I'm afraid.
Noam Chomsky?
Well, the major investments are oil and gas, but there are plenty of others. And Ms. Friedman's right. It's a major market and resource center. And the resources of Indonesia and the very cheap labor of Indonesia have always been a very prime concern of U.S. policy way back to the end of the Second World War, and remains so. I don't think the United States would even have to think about breaking off economic relations. It would simply have to indicate that they are under review, or that they're, U.S. multinationals, for example, oil companies, which are half state agencies anyway, can be induced, as they have been in the past quite often, to cut back, to threaten to cut back production. These are small moves. I don't think much is necessary. I should just add one point which can get lost. While we're talking about this, the end of the story may be coming very close. East Timor may be wiped out, and very soon. The reports from Dili, the few people who are left, mostly Australians, are that the Indonesian army, directed from Jakarta, is planning simply to destroy the place. They've burned down a good part of the city. They've killed thousands of people, according to church sources in East Timor. Even about a week ago, 3,000 to 5,000 have been killed. By now, probably more. UN reports about maybe a quarter of the population, or a third, driven out. The place is being robbed, looted. The reports from the UN compound in Dili are that the Indonesian army plans, if they leave, to just blow up the rest, blow up bridges, infrastructure, and so on. This may be pretty soon, but we're talking about something that is not months off.
Chris, could I ask a question?
Tom Friedman, please.
As a caller, if Professor Chomsky is right, I'd like to ask Professor Hefner what he thinks the strategy of the Indonesian military is here, these rogue or not rogue elements. That is, if that is correct, what do they think is going to happen, and how do they think they're going to walk away from this and benefit from it? What is their game as he sees it?
Bob Hefner. There's a couple of steps to it, or legs to it. First of all, the rogue elements, maybe that is the wrong term because it's a significant fraction within the military, want to discredit Wiranto and drive him out. He is seen as someone who is too sympathetic to pro-democracy forces, too soft on our regional independence and issues like that. So that's the first issue, drive Wiranto from power and drive Habibie out. Secondly, create a situation of such chaos in the country that there is no possibility that a democratic reform candidate like Megawati, even if she is does manage to make it to the presidency, that she can initiate any kind of serious political and economic reform which would, of course, challenge the privileges of some of the regional commanders who are no doubt, or it seems, supporting this kind of activity. Let me emphasize one final point, which is in terms of the responsiveness of the Indonesian military to these kinds of pressures. Wiranto is very responsive, so is, I believe, most of the Jakartan elite who support Habibie and his policy in East Timor. But look at what these, again, within quotes, rogue elements of the military have done. And for the past 6 months, there's been violence in Ambon, which is as bad, or almost as bad in any case, as what is taking place in East Timor. Official reports say 300 people have been killed. Unofficial reports say 3,000 to 5,000. The city of Ambon, which was bigger than Dili, is destroyed. So there are people in the military who are willing to pay an extraordinary economic price, or have the Indonesian people pay an extraordinary economic price to stay in power.
1-800-423-8255. Thanks for the question, Tom Friedman. Bill is on the line. Hello, Bill.
Chris, I'm listening to all of this, and my call originally was motivated by my deep shame to be being American. I mean, I'm stunned that Americans are not outraged and screaming at their government to do something here. You started out...
Well, a lot of them are.
Well, you started out the beginning of the hour by calling it the East Timor puzzle. It's not a puzzle. There's nothing complicated here. Your guests have pointed out this is naked aggression, period. I mean, if Indonesia is in danger of unraveling, let it unravel. If there's one thing the Indonesians have demonstrated is that they're not fit to govern anyone, period. It's that simple. And also solving this problem is really not that hard. Number one, you isolate the island, you forbid air travel over it, shoot down the planes if they decide to send any in, sink any warships the Indonesians might have, sever your connections with the Indonesian military. I mean, what strategic value can Indonesia possibly be to us with a thug government that terrorizes its own people? What strength can we derive from that? I'm just stunned that it is incomprehensible to me that Americans do not see their national soul at stake here. You know, you talk about China, we talk about all these other thugs that we happily do business with. And it never occurs to us that we've lost something of ourselves. We're losing our ideal. It's this.
Bill, it does occur to great numbers of people, I think, although at the same time we don't read about this story with anything like the urgency or the force or the detail that we do lots of other stories. Is it too late, Bob Hefner, to sort of get clear about it?
It's not too late, but look at Bosnia. It took us 7 years, 6 years, and repeated television broadcasts of awful violence for the American people to finally reach a consensus. When you're talking about any kind of movement on the international foreign policy front, if you want popular support, it takes a long time to build that. Indonesia, I as an Indonesianist know and regret, Indonesia does not loom large on the public
well, neither did Yugoslavia, for that matter.
No, it didn't. But again, it took a number of years and unbelievable violence, rapes and killings there too, to begin to get a consensus. And that consensus really wasn't that strong either, was it?
Professor Chomsky, I mean, this has been your battle for years and years to bring something like a balanced moral compass to the world. Why is it so hard in East Timor?
We should remember that the worst period, by far, much worse than Yugoslavia, was in the late 1970s, when something like a quarter of the population was wiped out. And the starvation, even the U.S. ambassador, when he finally got there, described as worse than Biafra or Cambodia. And at that time, it was extremely hard to try to get any attention. I mean, even an op-ed about it. The reasons why it's so hard, I think, have been stated very clearly. They were stated in the front page story that I quoted in the New York Times this morning, or yesterday. Seth Mydans, who's been the Southeast Asian correspondent for the Times, had an analytics story. He's now out of the country, like most journalists. He's in Jakarta. He said very simply, the territory of East Timor is a tiny one with little international importance, and Indonesia is a rich place which has a lot of interest to us. In other words, power politics as usual.
Bob Hefner?
If I could just add one thing, one consideration here. Indonesia, again, for the past year, has been in a very uneven, very uncertain struggle for democracy and democratization. There are significant elements in the population who are deeply committed to the pro-democracy movement, and it should be emphasized, there are elements of the government and the political elite who have decided that it's best to go along with that. The U.S. foreign policy, uneven as it has been, is premised on the hope that somehow, through gentle pressure, some of those people may come to power, namely Megawati, the leading vote getter in the national elections back in June.
1-800-423-8255 makes the East Timor connection. Bob is on the line.
Hello.
Hello, Bob.
My son is just back from East Timor, where he was an election observer, and he brings back a perspective that may address where's the outrage, Bill's question, where's American public outrage. The American press first, for many years, didn't report the problem, but recently has been reporting it as a civil war. The word back from the ground is that these militias, a large majority of them are from outside of Timor, East Timor, that they are and from West Timor and elsewhere, and that it's just a clever diplomatic ploy to call it civil war. It's interesting that the same language is still being used even this past week in the Globe, referring to the slaughter back in 75 and so on, as dying from civil war rather than from what's going on right now in the same. And I think once the American people realize that it's that kind of, that it is another Kosovo, or it's another Holocaust, then I think the outrage may come.
Bob, thank you. Tom Friedman, you get the last word, I think.
Well, I just think, given everything that's been said here, the trick, just going back to what Professor Hefner said and something Professor Chomsky said, I think is, how do we bring pressure to bear on this country at a time, I think we can't lose sight of, there are a lot of democratic forces there. I haven't been to Jakarta in 2 years, but certainly one thing that struck me was a new generation borning when I was there that clearly wanted to get rich without being corrupt and wanted democracy without having to have blood in the streets. And I think the real challenge is here, how do we bring pressure to bear to bring about an end to this Timor situation without also exposing those people to the kind of real wrath that you could have. The real, the thing they always remind you when you go to Jakarta is amok, as in run amok, is a Indo-Malay word. And, underneath the surface there, underneath the politeness of Javanese culture, there's a real potential, I think, for a real explosion.
Tom Friedman, we got to go. We're going to reread the Lexus and the Olive Tree and the Chomsky file on East Timor. Thank you, Bob Hefner. I'm Christopher Lydon. This is The Connection.